The market square smelled of sweat and sun-warmed rope, of horse's breath and the sharp copper of coin. A white glare of noon lay across the packed dirt, making everyone's faces a little harder, a little thinner. People stood in small knots, hands folded, eyes flicking between one another and the figure at the square's center. Kate Wine stood with her back to a post, her palms black with work, and a ribbon, blue, frayed, tied once around her wrist more from habit than hope. Her twins clung to the hem of her skirt, the little fist soft in the rough wool. The children were small for all their loud breathing. The twins were the pulse of whatever life she still held. One had a freckle like a tiny map on his cheek. The other kept fingernails chewed to white crescents. Both smelled of mud and milk and the home's thin candlelight, and when they put their faces to her legs, Kate's chest squeezed with a fierce, private tenderness. Her father stood a step away, his jaw set like a hinge. He had shoved her out into the square when he could no longer bear the weight of mouths to feed. He spoke in trimmed sentences that made cruelty sound like ledger accounting. "We can't keep both them and you," he said to the circle. "We don't have the grain. We don't have the work. You know the thing they do with such. Someone will take her. Someone with work. Someone with room." Her mother, hands folded over each other as if to hold herself together, watched the crowd rather than her daughter. When the father motioned for resignation, she did not step in. She shrank into herself like a shawl settling down the shoulders. Shame moved in the square like a low tide, pulling at Kate's ankles. The town's murmurs softened into a kind of glassy silence, punctuated by a child's sob and the occasional clink of a distant bucket. Men glanced away. Women kept their mouths busy. Someone tightened a hand on a purse rim. A boy tossed up a clump of dust and let it fall, as if to mark the moment out as routine. "They say she brings trouble," a woman muttered, but even that held an edge of apology, as if words could moderate what was being done in public. Kate's face was wet where she'd been pressed to smile earlier, an old habit, less for the crowd than because smiling had once kept laughter alive in other rooms. Her voice, when she found it, came out small. "Do it quick," she said, though she did not know whom she spoke to. "Quiet, if you must." A man laughed, too loud, like a bell. He threw a hand at the twins, as if to move them away from a stain. The children's fingers dug into her skirt. Kate watched them with a slow, private calculation. She had learned to count in the way that water measures out a day. She had no illusions about mercy from this town. All she had was the fur of her nerve and the soft bodies of the twins. It was then, at the brim of that public collapsing, that a wagon slowed at the edge of the square. The driver sat straighter than most.
A hat shaded his face, but his boots were clean and his reins well kept. The cloth of the wagon was a dark blue that had once been bright. The wood was oiled and notched in a careful hand. There was a certain spare order to his gear, a leather pouch at his belt, a brass-handled knife, a coiled rope stowed with neatness that said he had more than enough and used what he had well. He stepped from his wagon with a gait that did not demand attention. He did not speak loudly. He had grown into the sort of presence that fills a room without noise. People shifted as his shadow crossed them. Beau Thatcher. His name moved through the crowd after he moved through it, like a hand through grain. They spoke in odd syllables pulled from memory. "Has land out by the ridge," someone said. "Herd's good." Another added, quieter. "Pace fair." He walked up to Kate's father and set coins on the palm of the man's hand, his fingers steady. The pouch came from his waist, weighted with solidity. He did not count aloud. He did not announce he was saving her life. He simply said, "I'll take her. I'll take the children too." The father's hand closed, not in joy, but in commerce. The crowd exhaled as if a burden had been shifted, like someone had taken a spoiled load off a cart and tossed it aside. There was no cheering. There was no hero-making. There was instead a certain awkward relief and the quick, businesslike scolding. "You'll be bound to him, won't you? You'll do work." Beau's voice cut across the whisper with a plainness that was neither soft nor cruel. "I'll provide." It was a promise more than an explanation. He didn't parade his money. He placed it where it belonged and turned to the woman who had just been treated like a thing. Kate did not look grateful at first. There was a stubborn scar tissue in her chest that would not melt because someone set coins on a palm. Her mind was a splinter of fear and defiance. Still, the wagon and the slow, steady man seemed less like an end and more like a door. When the twins climbed up onto the box of the wagon with the sort of reckless faith small children can manage, Kate smelled smoke and leather and a hint of soap. She put one hand on the twins' heads, fingers going in a practiced way through hair, and the other against the wagon's side until her knuckles whitened. On the road, wind unstitched the smell of the square from her clothes. Dust rose in long, lazy ribbons behind the wagon. The land stretched, a raw and different kind of mercy. Kate watched Beau's hands on the reins, steady as a metronome. He spoke little. Once he reached for a tin cup and set it to the twins without looking up. The motion was private, like the clean turn of a wheel. Trial after trial had taught Kate to read small kindnesses for what they were. Night came when the wagon was still some miles from the ridge. The twins, one freckled and loud, the other biting his knuckle, fell asleep pressed against her skirt.
The stars pricked the cloth of the sky with a cold, indifferent tenderness. Kate cupped a child's brow with her wrist. He smelled of milk and the sourness of the road. The lull of the wheels made a shallow rhythm in her bones, and for the first time that day, she let herself breathe without counting the seconds. Arriving at the ranch was like opening a different book. The house sat under tall pines that whispered with their own old patience. The yard was long enough to make most town people feel small. A barn rose behind the house with the practical defiance of wood that always serves a purpose. There were rows of drying herbs and a lean shed where tools hung in an orderly line. Children were already moving about, older ones, curly-haired and direct, and the younger ones with a raw curiosity. Among them, the twins stood out because they hung to her like the last leaves on a branch. Their names were given to her with a casualness that threatened to make them less hers. Gideon tended the horses, Mira ran with a cup, Samson carried wood. The twins, Judah and Levi, were smaller than many, but alive with a sort of quick flame. Beau's housekeeper, a quiet woman with a jaw like a steady plow, offered Kate a towel in the doorway and a look that asked nothing but work. Kate's first days were clumsy in a world not her own. She burned the coffee until it tasted of char, though she scrubbed the cups until they shone. She spat stitches into a hem and sewed one sleeve longer than the other. A pot boiled over because she missed the moment when the stew needed to be turned down. Her hands, so used to other kinds of tasks, fumbled with the rhythm of a household that had its own logic. Shame rose in her like a tide, each misstep a fresh salt on the tongue. But Beau did not make shame a sermon. He would set down a fresh mug, or call her for a hand to mend a split board, and do the work alongside her. Once he took a burned pan, turned it, and began to scrape with such patience that Kate felt the scrape of her own shame begin to dull. He would not stand over her and scold. He'd show her where a blanket should be beat, or how to wash a shirt with enough pressure to remove the dirt, but not enough to break the fabric. There was a steadiness to him that said, "This is how you do it, and if you fail, you do it again." Kate found herself with tasks she had not had the chance to try, mending a collar for Gideon, coaxing a frightened goat into its pen, learning the exact weight of flour to make the bread rise. She learned the house by its rhythm. Morning light came in through thin curtains and fell across the table. Meat simmered slow and sure. The twins learned to carry a plate without tilting it toward disaster. Little rituals stitched themselves into the day. A mug left steaming near the window, a pencil and the scrap of paper on the table where Gideon practiced letters. A tin cup clapped to a wooden saucer and made a sound that meant supper. There were nights when the shame came back like a cold. When a pot cracked or a child keened, Kate's hands went to the old safe positions, fold and tuck, and make as if safety could be manufactured from work. It was in those moments that the small triumphs mattered most. She nursed a fevered Gideon through the long hours, dabbing his brow with cloth scented of pine tea. The boy's breath came back gilded with sleep, and he opened his eyes and looked at Kate with the foreign, private reverence of someone who had been saved by ordinary things. "Mama," he whispered, and the word landslid into her. It was small at first, an older child leaning her head against Kate's knee, a twin tugging at the fringe of her apron to show something found. The twins placed their faces into the hollow of her neck and made a sound that was almost possession. The housekeeper watched these moments with the careful comprehension of someone who had lived long enough to know the importance of naming. Kate did not force her love into speech. She let it move in gestures, the gentleness of wiping a face, the sternness of saying no when a child needed boundaries, the exact pressure of a hand when sewing a torn seam. Outside the yard, the town retained its own ledger. Beau's visits into the market were brief and to the point.
Supplies fetched, a horse sold, a little trading for goods. At the general store, women's eyes traced the line of Kate's braided hair, the telltale apron, an emblem now of domesticity and of being someone's shelter. They made comments in tones sharpened by small, precise cruelty. She couldn't keep her place, someone said the first time Kate stepped off the wagon at the market. Can't keep children, can't keep a home. What do you expect she'll keep now? The town's scorn slipped like a cold wind unchecked. A few women threw their glances so hard that silence became an accusation. The twins, who had once stuck their heads when anyone looked their way, now held up their faces as if demanding inspection. They scuffed their shoes through a puddle and stared homeward with the insolence of children who had been given permission to belong. Clay Vaughn was a man who smelled of whiskey and of tight pockets. He wandered like a shadow that deliberately knocked into things. He had a grin that never reached his eyes, and a hand that lingered where it should not. He watched Kate from across the store with a long, idle hunger, and made remarks that slid like oil across the floor. "You look better," he told her once, as if the world had simply corrected itself. "Must be nice, having a man's roof over you." His words were small torches. They warmed nothing, but left char streaks behind. When the day came that Clay's harassment turned physical, it was sudden and ugly in the way of storms that arrive without warning. He cornered Kate by the pantry door as she reached for sacks of flour. His hand came for her arm with a force that was both crude and entitled.
The store's light slanted, and the shelves seemed suddenly very near. Kate's first instinct was to absorb, to take the shock into the body because she'd done so often in smaller ways. Fear rose like bile. Something moved then that was not only Beau's strength. There was the housekeeper's cluck as she stepped forward, the clerk's throat clearing, an old man opening his mouth. But it was Beau who entered like a wall in a narrow doorway. He did not shout. He pushed Clay's shoulder with the kind of force that made bones remember they were brittle. Clay staggered back, surprise leading his face into anger. "Hands off," Beau said. The command was not full of heat, it was iron. Clay lunged. The scuffle was less a brawl than a sudden frantic knot of bodies. People watched with a suspended, guilty interest. Beau pushed Clay aside and pinned him near the crates. He pressed him until the man's breath made little bubbles through his teeth. Then Beau released him, but not without making a point. "If you touch her again," Beau told the man, the words simple as bread, "you'll answer for it. Around here, you won't touch what's under this roof." He set Clay straight with an unembellished gravity, then turned and bowed his head slightly to Kate, as if an apology for the way the world had been arranged to allow such things to happen in the first place. Clay left with a bruise on his cheek and a story that would ferment. People in the market shifted in the aftermath with the awkwardness of those who see a wrong and would rather tidy it than fix it. Rumors moved faster than facts. Clay's boasts and Beau's quiet command blurred into the town's gossip. That night, after a long houseful silence, Kate found Beau sitting on the back step with his hand pressed to the side of his face where it had taken a blow. The light of the moon smudged the shape of the yard into soft strangeness. The twins were asleep inside, bunched together under a threadbare quilt, and something like peace had come to the house like a slow tide. "I didn't mean him harm," Beau said at last, as if offering a confession. The hurt in his voice was not only from the scuffle. It carried the weight of recognition, of how hard the world is when people make it a business to be cruel. Kate crossed the yard and sat by him, the boards creaking under her like old bones. She had not been taught to tend men's wounds. Tending had been for children and animals and small scrapes. But hands have a ledger of their own. She rolled up his sleeve and found the skin broken and weeping a little. Her fingers smelled of soap and flour. She cleaned the wound with a cloth and bound it with gauze she had learned to fold just so. Beau watched her do it with attention, as if this were an unearned grace. "You could have left it be," she said, not unkindly. "Let it be his mess. You didn't have to step in." He gave a short, dry laugh. "Someone had to," he said. "I don't like men that take what's not theirs." She sat a moment longer, forming stitches in the air without moving her hands. The gesture was small, like a bird arranging twigs. "I didn't ask to be bought," she said finally. The words were not accusation so much as the unfastening of an old knot. "I had twins. I tried. It wasn't enough for them." Beau's eyes softened, not in theatrical pity, but in a way that belonged more to fact than to feeling. "You didn't ask," he repeated. "No one should have made you an object in their hands." Kate's story had cracks and stitches. She had been called things in the market. She had been measured and weighed, and found wanting by people who were too comfortable to see one another's hunger. But here, in the quiet order of the ranch, shame became something that could be tended, a wound not erased but held, washed and bandaged until it could be used again. Days folded into a kind of domestic apprenticeship. Kate taught Gideon to shape letters with a blunt pencil on scrap paper. She braided Mira's hair into a stubborn rope.
She learned the scarce art of making a stew stretch until it fed 6 and then 7. There were mornings when Judah, the freckled twin, would wake and call for milk in a voice that made her feet move like a bell. Levi would copy her movements in small, serious ways and carry a wooden spoon like a badge of office. Slowly, the name Mama began to fall from small mouths in ways that were not theatrical, but deep and essential. The twins pressed into her chest like two small anchors. When Judah called her name in the middle of a rain and curled up against her, the word lodged into the house like a peg. It did not feel like something that could be contrived or suddenly declared. It arrived as consequence of tending, and of the recognition that belonging was not granted from a market square, but built, brittle joint by fragile joint. Beau's money had given them the roof and the security. Kate's hands gave them the daily scaffolding of a home. There was a correction to how they both saw themselves. He was not their savior. He was a man with resources who used them to stop a cruelty. She was not merely rescued. She was a woman whose fidelity to small tasks made a family possible. The truth of both of them stitched into a fabric that was neither sacrificial nor glamorous, but serviceable and human. On another trip to town, this time with the twins tucked under their arms and Gideon carrying a list, Kate felt the stay like old weather. Women whispered. A man scowled in the doorway of the import shop. The twins, learning the ways of the world that went hand in hand with belonging, walked with awkward pride. A woman near the well spat a comment that was sharp enough to hurt. Bought and still won't keep a house, she said, meaning both to shame and to reassure herself. The twins reacted like children who had been told a lie about what they meant to people. Judah clutched Kate's hand until its knuckles went white.
Levi twisted his fingers in the fringe of her apron. The parish of small cruelty coalesced when Clavon stepped out from a shadow, his eyes flat and bright. He had been muttering at the horses. His face carried a bruise like a map of a scuffle. He looked at Kate with a slow kind of hunger and a plan like a curve in his mouth. He approached them with the pretense of doing business, and then let his hand land on Judah's shoulder as if to show dominance. He gave the twin a shove that made him stumble into an old puddle. The child's cry was immediate and sharp. The onlookers turned in a half-circular show, as if this were a spectacle. Clay's grin widened. "You think you can take what's ours and make it yours?" he said to Kate, a flutter of slur in his words. "You take his roof, you think you take our rights." Kate felt the old instincts flaring, those that had kept her from reacting in the market. She looked at the twins' faces, muddy and luminous, and then at Beau, who stood a few paces away, watching like a man who had long believed that things required a firm hand, and sometimes a fight. The confrontation that followed was a hard, short thing. It was not a neat film of blows, but the messy reality of people hitting and being angry. Beau pushed forward, not for the spectacle, but to end the fury. Clay lashed out with an unrefined hatred that came from being refused a domination he expected. Beau's arm moved to catch a strike aimed at Judah. He took the blow instead, the sound like wood on wood. When Clay fell back, some men in the crowd took his side. Others watched with the new, uneasy sense that perhaps they had been complicit in something petty and cruel. The twins clung to Kate as if she were the only thing left that mattered. In the aftermath, a silence fell heavy as a curtain that had been pulled. Clay swore and left, his face a distortion of rage and hurt. He would tell stories, and the town would choose sides in its own, small, practical way. Beau limped, but his limbs were more stubborn than his pride. Kate washed the dirt from a cut on his hand with water warmed by the stove. As she tended him, I recognized in his face the same humility she felt in her own hands. He watched her, not as someone measuring her to some new standard, but as someone wanting how to be held. "You didn't have to," she told him quietly. The words meant many things: thanks and contradiction, a refusal to be reduced into the role of passive recipient. He answered with a short look that gathered the day. "If you needed me," Beau said, "then I did what was right." He did not make claims for himself beyond that. That night, the twins slept between them on a straw mattress near the hearth. The house settled with the sound of old wood and small, contented breathing. Kate sat and stitched by lamplight, her needle traveling the rhythm of a life that had once been broken into small pieces. She thought of the market, of the way people's eyes had skimmed her over like a rough seam. She thought of her father and his ledger, of how easy it is for hunger to turn a mind to cold arithmetic and a heart to small cruelty. When one of the twins shifted and put a hand on her face, two warm fingers like a small map, he mumbled, "Mama," and turned in sleep. The name had come as if by gravity, naturally and without show. In that sound, a roof ceased to be only planks. and became a home. Safety, of a kind that does not erase the past, but makes the future possible, spread quiet and deep. The housework, the mundane repairs, the odd necessity of mending a fence post at dawn, these were the small strands that knit them together. The little rituals did more work than any grand declaration. There was the way Beau left a cup of coffee for her on mornings when she rose before the rest, the way he would fetch a fresh pail when the twins spilled milk, the way Kate would scrape down the table and lay out bread and butter with a certain care that declared a home instead of a transient shelter. Kate's hands became known in the house, the exact pressure to fold a diaper, the strength to lift a sleeping child without waking him, the lightness to tuck hair without tearing out a braid. She taught the twins, Judah with his freckles, Levi with his sticky fingers, to whittle small men from scrap wood, to butter bread thinly, to read letters from an old primer that had been stored in the parlor. They learned, and in learning, they claimed their place. There were times when the memory of the market surfaced like a bruise under the skin. It pulsed with small, sharp reminders, but these were met with hands and presents, a hug that closed tightly, a mug of warm tea held into a night, the steady, unremarked work of choosing to be present. Beau never made a scene out of his rescue. He did not write his name in glory above the door. He simply made sure that the stove had wood and that a fresh patch sat ready for mending. Weeks folded into a season. The twins grew a little taller, their freckled faces stretching into something like planed wood, smooth and solid. They began to sing stupid snatches of song and argue in a small ingrained way about who had the better wooden spoon. Gideon read aloud from a book that once had been boring and now seemed full of doors. Mira ran errands with a seriousness that made her look older. The house hummed with the ordinary energy of people making a life. Once, Beau rode into town for provisions and came back with a small carved toy for Judah. He placed it quietly into the boy's hand and left as if it were a triviality. Judah did not speak much, but he looked at the toy like a holy thing. The twins slept under a patchwork quilt that Kate had stitched with uneven fingers. The quilt was not perfect. The squares did not always meet. But when the twins lay under it, they were warm and known. When Kate stood on the back step with her hands on the twins' shoulders, looking out at the land that cut and softened into horizon, she felt something like a future press against her ribs. It was not the sort of future that promised neat endings. It promised only the possibility of days that could be counted for good. She thought of her mother at the market, of the way people would turn away. She thought of the small, private work of sustaining life by the ordinary arts of care. The last image that carried the story forward was a simple one. The twins asleep, their faces luminous in the lamp's amber, tucked together under Kate's quilt. Her hands rested across them, the fingers lightly curled, the ribbon at her wrist catching the light. Beau stood a little apart on the horizon of the doorway, his silhouette cut by the moon, looking at them with a face that had learned how to bake bread and to hold responsibility without making a show of it. Everyone had turned their backs on Kate in the market square. The town had kept its ledger and found her wanting. But one man used what he had, not to parade his wealth, but to steady a life. And in doing so, he offered a simple, stubborn shelter. The children's small voices, the daily gestures of care, the quiet tending of wounds, both on skin and in spirit, these were the things that restored her dignity. There would be more days of test and tenderness. Clavon might return with his stories. The town would continue to find faults in anything that did not fit their tidy expectations. But inside the house, in the ordinary acts that give meaning to family, Kate was being held and holding. The twins called her Mama and meant it. Beau stood watch like a man who understood the weight of what he'd done, and Kate, whose hands had once been counted as nothing, found that she could count the days by the way children's small mouths shaped the word that made a home. If this story of rescue and second chances moved you, stay with us. Consider liking and subscribing for more narratives that breathe into the small mercies of life. On the last night, Kate sat by the hearth and watched the twins sleep. The room smelled of clean sheets and pine tea. Outside, the wind came through the pines and sang a low, unadorned sound. She thought of the market square and the hard lines of that day. She thought of how thin gratitude had once felt, and how now it had weight enough to shape her future. Judah's breath came in the small, even rhythm of sleep. Levi's hand found hers and curled, warm and sure. Kate pressed her cheek to the top of their heads, felt freckles like tiny maps, and whispered names that were both claim and blessing. In the window, the moon hung like a thought. Beau moved softly into the kitchen and set a pot of water on.
He watched her across the dim room, and then, with a quiet motion, stepped outside and closed the door on the market's memory.
Inside, the house hummed with the ordinary work of people who had decided to belong to one another. There was no great trumpet, no miraculous unknitting of the past, but as Kate tucked the twins more tightly into the quilt she'd sewn with the uneven patience of a new mother and a woman learning to belong, she felt a small thing settle in her chest. Hope, real and practical, the kind that comes from bread on a table and a name spoken in the dark. Share this if the quiet work of belonging moved you, and come back for another story when you need a reminder that even the simplest acts can change a life.